one, know what your model know what kind of search model you're going to pursue well before you actually go out and start. The second is before you start your search, you should have your criteria pretty well listed and be able to verbalize them. And I kind of called it my elevator pitch, but be able to summarize that search in a minute or two to somebody, because that's what they're going to remember. Again, we talked about having a method, having a process, and finding a good business that hits on most, but not every one of those criteria. And the criteria is also to weed out and be efficient in what that process looks like. For me, a trust with the seller and trust with the team was just as important as their trust in me. And so building trust and making sure that if you're gonna do something that's gonna erode trust, you better be ready to just cancel the deal, because the deal's not gonna go through unless both parties trust each other.
Welcome to the How to Buy or Sell a Business Successfully podcast. The concepts discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only. No attorney-client relationship is intended or formed by this podcast. No legal advice is intended in the substance of this podcast. Feel free to check out our website, www.goforemanlaw.com. Enjoy the show and welcome your hosts, Jake Wayman and Sam Foreman. Welcome back to another episode of How to Buy and Sell a Business Successfully. My name is Sam Foreman. I am one of the co-hosts. I'm the founder of Foreman Law. Our firm focuses on mergers and acquisitions and ownership transitions. Our goal is to help our clients close their deals with confidence and peace of mind. One of the best things that's going on in my life right now is that it was recently Christmas. As of the time of recording this episode. By the time you're listening to it, it's probably April. My wife got me some of these little foil wrapped chocolate Santas, and I did what a smart person would not do.
Ate them all at once?
No, I put them in my pocket. And so later that day, I'm like reaching into my pocket, and I'm like, what in the heck is in there? And I'd completely forgotten. And it was like, just whatever that is that happens to chocolate when it's no longer in a solid state, that is what was all over my fingers. And so I'm like pulling my hand out. Of course, I'm in public at this point, and I'm trying to hide my hand that's now like covered with this like squishy brown goo stuff. And and of course, it's all over my keys because, of course, I put my keys in my pocket at that point. So on that note, I'd love to tell everyone that I have passed the Kansas bar's standard as being minimally competent enough to be an attorney.
He just needs a diaper is all he needs.
With that, I'm going to hand it off to my co-host, Jacob Wayman. Jacob, please, for the love of all that's holy, change the topic.
Thanks, Sam. My name is Jake Wayman. My wife and I are the proud owners of Orange Theory Fitness here in Wichita, Kansas, and also serve as a fractional business development executive for Wayman Consulting. I help companies grow their top line revenue. And Sam is... What are you laughing at now?
I don't know. It's residual laughter.
Residual laughter?
Yeah, it's residual laughter. I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at myself.
Something cool that's going on in my life is I'm learning that my soon-to-be 4-year-old is way more athletic than I am, whether that be with golf and the golf set that I got for Christmas. We have like one of those little Tykes basketball goals in our basement, and the kid drains threes.
Nice.
Like all the time. And it's like, and he just like looks like, hey, daddy, he'll throw it behind his back. And it's like, it's nuts. Like this kid is going to be athletic and it's awesome, but he's going to probably beat me at like everything in life. But I'm cool with that, even though I'm a very competitive person. But anyway, so really awesome to be joined today by Chip. Chip, we met Chip about a year ago, and just awesome dude. He was Navy guy, transitioned into Textron Aviation, and then went through the search process and bought a business here in the area. And just, I won't steal his thunder, but, I'm excited to have Chip on board. And so, Chip, if you want to just give us a little bit high-level intro of yourself and, maybe make a crack at Sam because, it just seems to be the thing we do these days.
Yeah, thanks. The best thing in my life right now is sitting between two ferns and the two of you. You guys are, it's a peach.
Yeah, we are amazing. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys. I got to know Jake and Sam independently, but also dependently as part of my search process. So it's only fitting that you guys invited me to talk about how good of advisors you were and continue to be. So well done.
That is why you're here. Thank you.
I'm originally from Kansas City, but as Jacob mentioned, I joined the Navy in 2006 and spent the next 11 years flying airplanes. All of my jobs in that service were tied to aviation, and I kind of had a passion and a love for aviation going into it. So when I left the military in 2017 and I went off and pursued an MBA, I knew that getting back into aviation was something that I wanted to do, and I figured out a way to get a job offer to come back to Wichita, which is where my in-laws live, and work for Textron Aviation, which is, you guys certainly know, but it's the parent company behind the brands of Cessna and Beechcraft. Mm-hmm. So that's what brought us back here, and after working there for 4 years, I launched a search. Sam was instrumental in helping me with that process, and Jacob introduced me to Sam. So in some ways, you were even more instrumental in that process, and ultimately acquired a aerospace manufacturing company located just south of town. Mm-hmm. So that was 9 months ago, and I'm still around, and we've made payroll for 9 straight months.
That's a win in itself. You have your hair still, so that's the positive. Yeah. What's that like?
It's follically very enhancing.
Well, Chip, thanks for joining us today. Tell our listeners a little bit more about all the steps that you went through on the search process, where you started looking, and, what types of things you were keying in on when you were evaluating businesses, and, kind of how you weeded out bad ones and started kind of narrowing it down to ones that you thought were worth further consideration.
Yeah. I mean, Sam, that's a long, long explanation. But if you go back to when I was transitioning out of the military, mm-hmm. I knew that owning and operating a small business was something that was a career dream of mine, and that getting an MBA was a part of that. I actually wrote my admissions essay at Harvard Business School about buying a small business in the Midwest and helping it grow. And then when I got to school in Boston, lo and behold, there was a whole academic discipline that was tied to the process of buying a small business. And what they called it, and what some other graduate schools call it, is entrepreneurship through acquisition, or ETA. And so I kind of learned a lot about it while at school. And then when I came to Wichita, I set myself up in kind of an industry and started going through the initial steps so that when I did decide to start a search, I had kind of all my ducks in a row. Ultimately, I started that search in a full-time capacity in September of 23. I met Jake a few weeks later, so probably the fall of 23, and Sam a few weeks after that. And I really kind of set up my search to be as efficient as I could, so that ultimately, in a full-time capacity, not earning any kind of income, that period of time was minimized, and I could find a quality business as quickly as possible.
No, that's terrific. Where all did you end up looking? And, I hear a lot of people talk about places like Biz Buy Sell and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I would say that there's a lot of people that spend a lot of time on Biz Buy Sell, and there's a lot of different ways to find businesses, and just like houses, there's lots of different ways to find houses. Mm-hmm. I found that the best method that I used was just talking to people, and that was a good fit for my overall personality. But I spent 3 months just networking my tail off. And it was through networking that I got introduced to Jake. I still remember meeting Jake at Whole Foods for a cup of coffee. Yep. And I remember wrapping up that and saying, "Hey, Jake, do you know anybody who else might be kind of tapped into that industry or tapped into the buying or selling of a business?" And it was before the podcast existed, I think, Sam. So he couldn't just say, "Go watch me and Sam talk about all of our wins." But he did introduce me to Sam, and he introduced me to some other folks that actually were super instrumental in that process. And it was through kind of that regimented but very deliberate networking, talking, and introducing myself that ultimately led me to the people who were selling CMJ.
Mm-hmm. And how many people do you think you ended up, connecting with directly through that process?
God, through phone, through email, through face-to-face, hundreds. So in 3 months, there's 90 days, and I tried to meet 3 people every day. So that's 270.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's probably about right. People, some of whom would say like, hey man, I don't know anything. Sorry.
Right.
And some people who said, hey, here's my Rolodex. Who do you want to meet?
Right.
And I remember one individual who was become a bit of a mentor who basically pulled out all of his different organization directories and said, tell me who you want. Who do you want to talk to? And he introduced me to probably 10 or 15 people himself.
That's awesome.
And I still remember the conversation with Jake. I walked away with 5 people and ended up working very, very closely with 3 of them.
That's awesome.
So that was our process. That was my process. And it worked well for the kinds of businesses I was looking for.
Well, so talking to, I mean, and it's awesome. I had a mentor of mine that I met in Kansas City who she kind of invested in me of the coffee mentality. So there's 3 times to have opportunities to meet with people during a day and don't waste them.
Yeah.
And, I love that because it's, it expedited your process. But what sets you apart from other searchers or other people who've been through the business, it's like you kind of knew that criteria going in, what you were looking for. Like when we met, what impressed me about you is like, and that's why I was open to making introductions, you knew what you were looking for. You were very professional. You're like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. And kind of talk through that of like, because you started your MBA knowing what you wanted to do, and you went to Textron to kind of gain some more, some experience, what have you. And so in this, so like, what was that criteria of what you knew you were looking for, and how did you go about building that out? Yeah,
I would say that in business school is where I refined what kind of model I wanted to pursue. I knew I wanted to do this by myself. I didn't want to have a partner. I knew that there were different ways to fund this, and I knew that I had enough life I had saved, and I was living in an area where I was going to be moving to an area where it was actually pretty low cost of living. Wichita, as you probably most listeners will agree, is not San Francisco or Boston. And so I could afford to do this as a self-funded searcher and not have people in a fund backing me in that process. And I knew that I wanted a primarily geographic search, which meant that I was looking in the Wichita area, and then I would move away from that. When I started my search, meeting with people, I had a list of 20 criteria, and they ranged from, hey, businesses of 20 to 50 employees, of size anywhere between $500 to $2 million of EBITDA, to industries that I thought were interesting to me, where I'd be excited and eager to come to work. Things like the seller. I didn't want a seller who was just selling because they wanted to do something else. I wanted a seller who was committed because they were retiring. And I had this list of 20 criteria, knowing that the perfect business that was going to hit on every single criteria probably didn't exist. But if I could find a business that didn't hit on 10 of them, that was a quick to the trash.
Yeah.
Right.
And part of the role of a searcher is to quickly and efficiently weed out businesses, not just, go pursue businesses. And so a criteria really allowed me to get rid of businesses that weren't a good fit and tell my story in a way that somebody like Jake, or in the case of Sam, I told you about the businesses that I was looking for, and you, lo and behold, knew someone who was selling that exact kind of business.
Yeah.
And you're the one who actually introduced me to the brothers who ended up selling. So I think that coming into a search with a clear set of criteria, whether it's 10 or whether it's 20, has a number of benefits. And for me, it helped me do it a lot more efficiently.
So when you're looking at that set of 20 criteria, like and you said needed to hit like 10 plus for it to be, one you'd want to pursue, but like what's like the top 1 to 3 things that you were like, these companies you were searching for needed to have? Yeah,
obviously I knew what my budget was. Yeah. So based on size and based on multiples, I knew that I wasn't going to go buy a business that was making $10 million of EBITDA a year. I mean, that was just, that'd be like me going to Beverly Hills and trying to buy a $50 million mansion. Like that's out of my price range. So having real concrete ones that were easily explainable to somebody like Jake or to Sam, those are obvious. To me, the other thing was I wanted a place that was going to be exciting for me to work. And aviation is my passion. And so I was really trying to target aviation companies, but I looked at a landscaping business and that was not something that would have immediately popped off as, hey, Chip's been a Navy pilot and he's worked in aviation, so he should go buy an irrigation company. That obviously didn't didn't necessarily make as much sense. But by writing it down, it at least allowed me to kind of funnel those targets in a way that, again, there wasn't going to be one that hit all 20. And CMJ did not hit all 20, but it certainly hit on enough that made it interesting and allowed me to go pursue it in an efficient way.
Yeah. No, and I like that you went in with that level of clarity, because it did help create enough of those hooks to try to find that right kind of company. And I talk to folks, quite often that are looking for something, whether it's either on the sell side or the buy side, who just don't have enough of, or at least from my perspective, don't have any clarity. They're like, hey, my only criteria is, and then they proceed to describe something that captures probably 80 to 90% of the businesses that might be for sale.
That's not helpful.
Right. Or it's just so open-ended that, it's not memorable enough for somebody to help you filter it down. And so starting with enough filtering criteria to eliminate a lot of things can help you be much more focused. Because like you said, there is a time window on that search process.
Yeah.
And if you don't, focus, you miss the opportunities to really make that period work as hard for you as it needs to.
Yeah. The other thing was, there's a lot of businesses that are struggling that are for sale. And I knew from the get-go that buying a turnaround for my first business or my only business, like that was not going to be the kind of business that I found to be as it was going to be a much riskier proposition. And granted, you can find businesses for sale cheap, but if they're not profitable or they're not good businesses, it's not really a good investment. It's just a good way to spend a couple $1 million.
Right.
So,
I mean, a lower sales price isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that's really landed with me a lot over the last year or so, is that, I mean, your goal when you're finding a business is to try to create an exchange of as much value as possible from the seller to the buyer. Because if you do that really well, you don't destroy the value in the process where the seller has something that's worth something and then it just kind of leaks out because they've allowed the business to atrophy, which happens a lot. You mentioned not wanting to buy a business that was a turnaround. How did you identify that? Because I assume most sellers aren't saying, hey, my business is in shambles.
Yeah.
It really needs somebody who can fix it. Although some of them have that level of candor. How did you sort of spot that in the process to say, this is a business that is kind of struggling and really needs to, get turned around?
Yeah. CMJ, the owners of CMJ were very transparent, and that built a lot of trust. And because they were so transparent and they gave me their financials, their story made sense. And everything that they did continued to build on that trust. And I hope that everything that I did with them built on the trust. Sam, you mentioned early in the conversation that buying and selling business is oftentimes about that seller relationship, and that the buyer and the seller are not independent. They're very codependent on each other, continuing and moving forward. And the moment that you lose trust with the seller or with the buyer is the moment the deal goes south.
Right. Right.
And so what they did is they showed their financials, and their financials looked good. They let me talk to their employees, their current employees who are actively engaged in managing the business. And that is ultimately what built the most trust is as I went through the due diligence after the initial process. So we went through an LOI phase. And once we were going through due diligence, they said, hey, please don't interrupt our business operations, but please feel free to come down and chat. And, they opened the business up to me in a way that that really enhanced that trust. And I never once questioned whether they were being forthright and honest. Even if we found out that something that wasn't necessarily the way that we had thought it was, I always interpreted that as an admission of accident, not an admission of because I knew the right answer and I was withholding it from you.
Right. And I felt like you did a really great job of managing that relationship throughout the process. And that's not something that every buyer does a good job with, of maintaining that relationship and building that relationship with the seller. But I mean, ultimately, that's what gets deals done, is that level of trust.
Yeah.
I mean, trust is the currency that gets deals done. And as soon as that trust dips below a certain level in a deal, I mean, the deal's probably over, or it just gets a lot more difficult to get done. And I mean, especially businesses that have been around for decades, there's a lot of accumulated value, of accumulated decisions that's tied up in that, as a buyer, you need to understand to be able to pay a fair price and have confidence paying a fair price to the seller. And I mean, from the seller perspective, that can feel like, you're under the interrogation lamps, being constantly scrutinized. And, what we want sellers to understand, and we're trying to do a better job helping communicate this through the process, is that we're not looking to like go create some sort of gotcha. Just like you said, you're not trying to catch somebody in the lie. You're just trying to understand. You're trying to understand
the truth. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So that you can structure a fair deal. Because if you don't get enough information, then either you don't have the confidence to get a deal done, or you've got to account for risk some way that's going to probably leave dollars on the table for the seller.
Yeah.
And so if a seller wants to maximize, their selling price, they've got to figure out how to get comfortable with sharing enough information and building that kind of relationship with a buyer, so the buyer has the confidence to say, I know what I'm getting and I'm willing to pay top dollar for it.
Yeah. One of our previous guests talked a lot about culture, and the culture that you're acquiring. And, it sounds like with CMJ, I mean, that was a thing that the previous owners really had, was they built a strong culture. I mean, they were like, hey, like, this is what we're doing, come in and, talk with our employees in, because if that's not there, I mean, here comes a new leader into the company that you're inheriting. The culture is what you're doing.
Yeah. And I bet, Sam, if you go back 9 months ago or 10 months ago, if I hadn't had that level of confidence based on my experience being in the business, there were probably some things that would have caused me to walk. And that's not because the business was bad. That's because I didn't understand some things. And at that time, for a first-time buyer, if you don't know, it's almost the risk is just so high. So being in the business allowed us to kind of see past some questions or see past some unknowns that allowed us to move forward. And that's really, it was that trust that got the deal done.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that you're absolutely right on that. And I mean, for sellers that are working with buyers that are being really diligent in the process, which a good buyer will be really diligent in the process. I mean, one of the things you've got to constantly remember is that in most cases, that buyer is using some kind of bank funding.
Yeah.
Right. And that means that you're going to the bank and you're putting, personal guarantee on the line. You might be putting your house on the line. I mean, you're taking a lot of personalized risk to make that deal happen. And it's not just the risk that's on paper, right? That's a risk that you go home to every day.
Yeah.
And so
still do.
I'm 5 years later, still going home to it. Yeah.
And so for sellers, remembering that, your buyer wants to be really, really careful and really diligent in the process. Because they care. Well, and because they're smart.
Or because the bank's asking them to.
Yeah.
A lot of the questions that I was asking weren't necessarily questions I was even smart enough to come up with. They were questions that the bank was saying, hey, we can't finance this deal unless you tell us X, Y, and Z. And again, I think that the sellers in this particular instance understood where I was coming from. And it was part of our initial conversation is how I was going to finance that deal. And I said right from the get-go, like, hey, I'm new to this. This is my first time buying a business. And in most cases, a person selling a business, it's going to be their first time selling a business. And so we were kind of relying on the bank also to help guide us through that process. And we were fortunate to have attorneys both on the buy side and the sell side that kind of continued to steer us in the direction in the best interest of both parties.
Yeah, and I think something that Sam and I preach a lot on this podcast is the power of community. And I think that's what you kind of allude to, not only in the process of meeting, couple hundred conversations that you've had, but you surround yourself with a great group of advisors. So you could go through the process and confidently make the acquisition in post-close. I mean, you probably had a lot of questions post-close and you still surrounding yourself with great people too. So to kind of talk about, I mean, you were newish to Wichita but your in-laws were here and everything, but kind of talk about how, if being in the Midwest has been like, has that been something that's more been a value add for you to be here with buying this business and everything? Yeah,
I think that, Wichita is known as the air capital of the world. So it was no accident that we moved to Wichita knowing we wanted to potentially buy an aviation business. That was kind of part of our thesis about moving here. It was also the Midwest tends to be a much lower cost of living. So if you're going to be a self-funded searcher, sure makes a lot of sense to find a place where you can get a mortgage for $1,000 or $2,000 than $20,000. So there were some very obvious reasons why the Midwest and Wichita in particular was a good fit for us and for other searchers. There's also kind of this small town but access to big city. Wichita. I've got friends in Kansas City that search, and there is a community of searchers in Kansas City. I don't know if there's that level of kind of unity or community in the search community in bigger cities like New York or Boston, but it certainly exists here and in Kansas City that I've seen firsthand.
Jake and Sam here.
Thank you for joining us. If you find this content helpful, please like, subscribe, share it with a friend, and especially leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or iTunes. It really helps us out a lot.
Yeah, 1 star, it's on Sam.
Yeah, it's definitely on me. One of the, you mentioned the, kind of the banking partner that you used on the deal. Just a practical tip for folks that are listening. Whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, especially if it's an SBA finance deal, making sure that the bank that's involved really knows what they're doing. Because you were working with one that really knew what they were doing, the folks at Emprise. We run into banks every now and then that aren't experienced SBA lenders, and their ability to predict timing and their ability to accurately predict, whether or not they can fund or finance the deal is much less reliable than when you're dealing with somebody that really knows what they're doing. And if you're on the sell side and you're partnered up with somebody that's not using a reliable bank, that jeopardizes your whole deal process. Yeah. And if you're on the buy side, same thing. You're putting your money and your time on the line without, enough reliability, and that can make a huge difference. And so,
yeah, nobody's reinventing the wheel.
Right.
People have been buying and selling businesses. So I was fortunate to get put in touch with Jake, who had bought a business, and he put me in touch with kind of his deal team. And if I was going to sell a business, I'd reach out to people who have sold businesses. Who have they used on their side? And if you're selling to someone who's already sold a business, try and get a hold of the seller of the business that they bought previously. And that's really how you gain trust, not only with the other party, but with the people on your own side.
Yeah.
Is, ask around, and just because there's one person doesn't mean you have to take that one person, shop around at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. When you think about some of the things that have helped you prepare for success as a business owner, what are some of the things that you either learned during the deal process or since then that have been really useful as a business owner?
Yeah. One is just a good assessment of my own skills. And during the search process, I'm trying to be as efficient in that, which means anything that I outsource is something I'm going to pay for. And I mean that literally, I mean that figuratively. There are things like attorney stuff that I can't do no matter how much I spend on them, or accounting stuff. So I used professional attorneys and professional accountants to double check and make sure that I wasn't missing something. But when it came to like doing a quick assessment of financials, I took an accounting class, debits on the left, credits on the right, or maybe that's wrong. I don't even remember anymore. But spend time as the searcher doing the things that you as the searcher can do. And if you're on the sales side, if you're selling a business, do things as a seller that you can do without having to outsource those. So I spent a lot of time. Once I was under LOI with CMJ, it became my full-time job for 3 months doing due diligence on CMJ. And look, in 40 hours in a week, you can spend a lot of time struggling through accounting just to make sure that you know what it is an income statement is showing you or what a balance sheet shows you. So, outsource only what's necessary and treat that purchase or treat that sale as kind of a full-time job if you can.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. We've talked on this show before about, how dependent good decisions are on good information. There's very few instances where the power of your decisions is magnified as much as it is during the deal process. Yeah. And so the better the information that you have, both in terms of the quantity, but also the depth and quality of it, the better the decisions that you're going to make. and the more confidence you're going to have in those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether you're on the buy side and you're looking at a business or you're on the sell side, understanding that the amount and quality of the information that's exchanged has a lot to do with how good the deal is going to be for both parties.
Yeah.
But then also how successful the business is going to be after closing. I've had good people who ran, good processes, but just didn't get good quality information from the sell side, and it hurt the business going forward. And so, especially for sellers that are thinking about, how they want their employees taken care of after closing, how they want their customers taken care of after closing, how they want their business to continue to create, jobs and continue to fund dreams in their town. You need to think about how successful your buyer is going to be after closing, because it is not a zero-sum game. And you also want your buyer to be successful, because you don't want them going back and looking at the purchase agreement going, I feel like they didn't tell me the truth here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a good process, you're not going to, people aren't going to spend their time poring over all that stuff because they're going to be too busy, successfully operating the business after closing, which is what you want. So.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're 9 months into owning the business. What's been the biggest shock transition into, being the business owner and the president of the company?
Yeah, I'll be honest that the team that we have in place that stayed with the business has made my life super easy. If there's one thing that I could say that the sellers did a lot of things right as they built this business, but one thing that they did is they built a team that was able to run the business without them.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they built their own leadership team, and
Yeah.
they weren't absentee owners by any means, but it's that leadership team that stayed with the business that's allowed me to think a little bit bigger, think a little bit more strategically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in aviation manufacturing. Aviation is cyclical. And so when the two largest aviation companies in the Midwest go on strike, ironically at the same time, it does tend to present some challenges with some financial details.
Yeah.
So I knew going in that we were a cyclical business and risk associated with that. But making sure that we saw those trends coming and that we pivoted as best we could, that's been a challenge.
Yeah. Well, I knowing you, you're a very growth-minded person, very strategic person, so what are things that, you're 9 months in, what things are you wanting to implement to grow it? Or what are kind of things you're wanting to put your strategic energy into to really to scale to a different level? Because I imagine you have growth on the mind.
Yeah, certainly that is, first year of ownership is, hey, don't screw this up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, if we can just make our debt payments, that's a win. And we've had a great year. Again, I think that part of that is because the business has continued to operate, and I've been able to kind of operate at this really high level. I'd call it the 30,000 foot level instead of being down on the ground. But yeah, growth is certainly on our mind. And how do we continue to provide a quality product to our customers while still ensuring that we meet quality, schedule, and price, but still looking at kind of new opportunities. And that's what we've done is we've looked at finding some new customers. We've tried to look at some different industries that maybe aren't quite as cyclical as aviation is. So when Sam and I need our knees replaced or our hips replaced, maybe I'll be making parts for that, and Jake can coach us around and get us back on our feet.
So good at Orange Theory. We accommodate that.
You may have trouble with a metal detector, but
that's okay. There's no TSA. So we've looked at maybe strategically, how can we look at other industries and other parts of aviation so that we're not putting all of our eggs into those baskets that are a little bit riskier.
Yeah. No, I really like one of those observations that you had about the quality of the team that you were able to take on from the seller. Yeah. And when that's something that consistently comes up, especially in small businesses, is that it's this broader concept of transferability of value. And when the seller or the owners of the seller are so integrated into the business that a large amount of the operational value is tied up in the work that they continue to perform, that really puts in many cases a value cap on what that business can be sold for, because it limits how much value can probably be transferred to the buyer in the deal.
Exactly.
Because, they may want to be wanting to retire. Or the buyer may not want them to stick around because the buyer's got to build their own relationships with customers, their own relationships with the team, et cetera. And if you're a seller and you're thinking about how can you maximize the value of your business, I mean, building a transferable team is huge. I mean, we just closed a deal where that was, made a significant impact. Probably was the reason that a deal was possible, and definitely the reason that it was possible at the value it was for another client was because they had a couple of years ago taken that step to say, I'm going to remove myself from management and have somebody else doing that. I'm going to make sure that this is in a place where a buyer could actually come in and buy a business without my involvement.
That continues on day one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because you also have the donut truck phenomenon. If you're the seller and you're ingrained in the business,
tell us about the donut trucks.
Honestly, I am going to start a donut truck sometime because I've never actually seen one. It's just a colloquialism or whatever that people use of, you get hit by the donut truck and then you're gone. It's this mythical truck that runs around.
What's that? I thought it was the beer truck.
It is the beer truck also. It's the donut truck by day.
Just like our new podcast, the Big Sexy Money Podcast.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. But how long before, and I don't know if you know the answer to this.
12.
But the answer is 12. The units are undefined, but the answer is 12. How far before they entered the sales process did the owners of CMJ start to make those transitions to where they had a transferable team?
Yeah, I would say that the way that they had structured the business really from the get-go, as they pursued growth, and I'm just kind of spitballing, maybe 5 years ago is when it was actually a little bit longer than that. They had brought on some other folks to manage the day-to-day so that in their case, one had another job and the other one was actually doing a lot of the work, but not on the management side. What you described was 2 years. I think that's a good amount of time. If I was going to sell a business of this size, bringing someone in 2 years before I wanted to actually sell the business seems right.
Yeah.
Less than a year would be like, this person's a substitute,
right?
And this person hasn't demonstrated that they actually know what the heck they're doing. But 2 years or longer to me feels like, hey, they've now got it under their belt. The business runs with their leadership, and an owner can provide strategic value,
right?
But a day-to-day operations is not where I, as a buyer, want to have to step in and assume responsibility for on day one.
Right. Yeah. And, for some folks, they may not have as deep an appreciation as you've acquired of what is that value of being able to come in and operate at like that 30,000 foot view where you're able to come in and provide that strategic direction for the business, that executive function, while being able to rely on the team for the operational day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, I'm not saying I'm good at it. I mean, we're assuming that just because I point us in a direction means it's a direction worth going. If I buy a profitable business, I want to make sure that business continues to be profitable even as the business ownership transitions. Now, if I can spot some trends, or if I can spot an opportunity just based on my own experience or based on something that I've read about, that's all upside. But what I don't want to do is buy a business and then as part of that transition, have to assume all the responsibility for buying, selling, operations. I need those functions handled by someone who's been with the business for a period of time.
Right. Because inevitably, if you're having to step into that execution role as opposed to that executive role, that's going to put a cap on your ability to learn about the most high value things for the future of the business.
And I can screw that up a whole lot more easily by not knowing how to actually deliver a customer's parts. Yeah.
Right. And so, for sellers that are thinking about positioning themselves to have a good deal process, thinking about, how well is your team trained, and also how well are your key processes documented?
Yeah.
There's some stuff it's just like, this is always the way it should be done. That should be written down or recorded in some fashion so that there's enough predictable consistency there, but also, some positions have turnover.
Yeah.
When you through the acquisition process, did the key employees that you had, did they sign any agreements to hang on with you afterwards?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that the level of trust between me and the sellers was just as important as the level of trust between me and the existing employees. They kind of came in to work every day, and here was this random dude just showing up and saying he's going to potentially change everything. And there was a level of concern. I don't know if I'd say fear.
Yeah.
But there was definitely some questions from them about me. And I tried to approach that relationship a lot the same way I did the seller relationship. Transparency. This is who I am. My goal buying a profitable business meant I didn't want to make any big changes. And because making a big change means I'm probably going to screw it up. And I think they felt that I was being genuine and transparent. And, we're a year into it. Now they've actually seen it play out.
Yeah. The
answer is yes, there was some. I basically asked them to stay with the business. Give me a year. If after a year you feel like this isn't a good place for you, that's fine. But I'm not going to change anything that's related to your core function or what you're taking home to your family. I promise I won't make any big changes like that in the first year. And that allowed us both to kind of say, okay, now we've got we've got a time that we can learn, and it's not like I'm going to put them out of a job or they're not going to leave me right in my time of need.
Yeah. And you had, what is not always a common experience, where you had the opportunity to meet some of those key employees in advance, to where you could actually develop some of those relationships.
It was critical.
And
it's not always the norm, but for a seller who is looking to build trust, there's nothing that's more trustworthy for a buyer than getting to meet the team.
Right. Yeah. Because in that instance, and for a lot of small businesses, the key value to transition is the team.
Yeah.
And if you lose the team, or you don't have confidence they're going to stick around, you got to factor in that risk somehow, or at some point there's just not a deal there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so, it sounds like in your instance, one of the ways to mitigate that risk was to start to develop your own relationships with them before there was actually a deal in place, as opposed to, hey, the deal's closed, here's your new boss, good luck.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I've heard horror stories where once that deal gets signed and employees say, oh, this is not what I want to do.
Right.
All of a sudden, the value of the business goes from significant to very minimal.
Right.
And that was my biggest fear.
Right.
In the whole process, was that there was going to be nobody that comes to work on day 2.
Yeah. but again, like
oh no.
Well, you like your method even of the search process. it shows like how attention to detail you were and how much you cared through the process, instead of just saying, oh, I'm just this guy that's going to buy anything that I can find. It's like, I want to be very methodical about that process. And they saw that there, and that trust, that transfer of trust was there. And I think, you could honestly down the road if this is write a book on how do you successfully transition to ownership through that search process, because, you've been able to retain that, grow it, but that the transfer of trust is there. Because in this business, you don't know how to probably operate, the CNC machine or whatever. It's like there's a lot of things you don't know how to do, and you need them to be able to still come in every single day and clock in.
Yeah. I knew I was probably going to buy a business in which I was not a technical expert, unless that business involved flying airplanes.
Yeah.
But I've done that before in the military. A lot of times junior officers are responsible for aspects of operations that they haven't gone to school for. So I led a team that took care of the engines of the airplane.
Yeah.
I knew what this hand did, but I didn't know what any of the other stuff had.
Well, and again, it goes back to, searchers and everything. A lot of them, like most, like in your situation, like you had time in the Navy, you had time at Textron, and then, you, to how I say this, you had gray hair to be able to go actually buy it. So if you were just a 24, 20.
What a jerk.
Whoa.
Golly.
But hear me out. But like, if you were, 25, 26 coming out of, business school, oh, I'm going to go buy a company. You've never even once managed a person or anything like that, I mean, you had that the background. I think telling your story was probably a critical piece of it.
Yeah, I think storytelling is a part of it. And I think, don't get me wrong, I don't think you need an MBA to go buy a business. I don't think you need to go to college to buy a business. I do, however, think that you need to build some credentials that resonate with a seller, that resonate with that team. Because, I mean, there's nothing that says that the random person who introduces themselves is going to be capable of running that business. But a 24-year-old with very little experience in that field is different than me. And I was older. I was 35. Yeah. No, I was 40. This was last year.
It seems
how
like
old
so
am I?
much.
How old am I?
Being a business owner is good for your health, no matter what anyone else says. Go on.
Go to Orange Theory so you stop aging. So I was an older guy.
Let's go.
I was an older guy going through the search process, which I think did help. But I know a lot of guys who search in their 30s.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot of guys who have been successful searching in their 20s.
Well, like, so when we bought Orange Theory, I was 32.
This was like what was it? Last year?
Yeah. It was
negative years ago.
Yeah. But like, again, like it was that when we were in that process, it was, yes, a lot of the employees were younger than I was, but here I am as like this who was a member of Orange Theory, becoming the owner of Orange Theory. And honestly, I've said this in one of our last podcasts is sometimes COVID was almost a blessing in disguise for us because it allowed us to hit a hard reset on our culture.
Yeah.
Because we were inheriting a culture and I almost came in day one. Oh, we're going to do this, and this. They came from a semi-absentee owner who lived in Denver running this business, and they were not used to someone who was there every single day. And so, again, it's like, I think there's a lot of things that I would have done differently in our process. I mean, the way, just hearing from you, it's like, man, you were very, like, again, back, I said, methodical about how you went part of, approaching the business and your transition process into the business.
Yeah. And I got lucky. I mean, but I'm not going to say that just because you've done the perfect search means you're going to crush it. But I think being methodical and being diligent helps with luck a whole lot, or at least it helped me eliminate the ones that weren't going to be lucky.
But again, it goes back to relationships. I mean, you wouldn't have found CMJ without the 200 plus people that you met.
Yeah.
I mean, and even the people, even the companies you didn't pursue and the relationships you built, I mean, those will last forever for you. I mean, in terms of like, the knowledge base, everything you're getting from it. So, I mean, it's like you were lucky, but there was like, you did a lot of work to get to that place.
Well, I remember when I was in, I think it was in law school, a neighbor of mine who happened to be a judge said that
your judge on your
Your Honor, you gotta let me off easy. I'm too good looking for prison.
So is he the one we have to blame for you becoming an attorney?
Yeah. No. But he said luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And I mean, I know it's a little bit cliche at this point, but I genuinely believe that. When people are really well prepared, they take the time to learn, they're diligent with their process, they put in the work to make the process work for themselves. They tend to encounter more and better quality opportunities and be ready for them more than folks that are just kind of hoping that something good happens.
Yeah.
I mean, in your instance, you're really diligent about it. You didn't just, say, hey, I hope something good happens. You're like, this is my job now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you committed to the process. You were really methodical about it. And I like that you had really focused criteria. That some folks run into trouble with just their net is so broad that it's like, well, hey, how do you learn from comparison?
Yeah.
Because when you've got enough criteria to force the funnel to close down a little bit, you start to see how those data points aggregate with relation to each other. And then you start to see, well, hey, this similar company is doing much better than this other company, and there's a reason for that, and I can learn something from that helps me, better prepare to be a successful business owner. Because at the end of the day, it's not just like, hey, do I get a successful deal process? do I get a closed deal? It's like, that's not the goal.
Yeah.
I mean, the goal is as a searcher and a buyer is to become a successful business owner.
Yeah.
And so your whole process needs to line you up for how do I become successful on the other side of the deal process.
Yeah. Everybody thinks, they cross the finish line at closing and like, hey, yeah, we've done it. Hey, guess what? You're a business owner now.
Start.
Congratulations. That's you are now starting.
Yeah.
That was just the preparation.
Little did he know.
Yeah.
A new race had just begun. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Thank you guys for laughing at my cheesy jokes. And if you're not laughing at my cheesy jokes, I know you're laughing at me, and that's okay.
I mean, I was crying earlier at you, so
Chip, thanks again for joining us today. For our listeners that are thinking about becoming a business owner in the future, that are thinking about that search process, what are some of your key takeaways that you would, key pieces of advice or recommendations that you would give to them?
I kind of hit the highlights. One, know what your model know what kind of search model you're going to pursue well before you actually go out and start. The second is, before you start your search, you should have your criteria pretty well listed and be able to verbalize them. And I kind of called it my elevator pitch, but be able to summarize that search in a minute or two to somebody, because that's what they're going to remember. And part of the search process is not just, getting to know, is not necessarily getting the specific business, but when that person hears of a business 6 months down the road that's for sale, I wanted them to say, hey, who is that Navy pilot who I talked to 6 months ago who was looking for that aviation business?
Yeah.
And give something that's memorable.
Yeah.
Again, we talked about having a method, having a process, and finding a good business that hits on most, but not every one of those criteria.
Right.
And the criteria is also to weed out and be efficient in what that process looks like. Again, I can't emphasize the trust piece. For me, a trust with the seller and trust with the team was just as important as their trust in me. And so building trust and making sure that if you're gonna do something that's gonna erode trust, you better be ready to just cancel the deal, because the deal's not gonna go through unless both parties trust each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, those are great pieces of advice. Well, thanks again for joining us. And to all of our listeners, thank you for letting us be part of your journey. Because we know that local communities thrive when there's great businesses, and great businesses exist in part because great transitions are able to happen. And so we wish you the best of luck in your journey, and please join us for future riveting content where we will tell many more amazing jokes and amazing stories. Thanks for joining us, and stay warm out there. Unless you're listening to this in July, in which case go get some air conditioning on you. Okay, bye.
Thank you for joining us today. For future episodes, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And please check out our website at www.goforemanlaw.com/learning.